Megan.
I'm kidding.
I'm Ron.
And Washington Irving, he was born in New York City, lucky, in April 3rd, 1783. He was the youngest of 11 children. He was quite spoiled as a child. His parents were William and Sandra Irving, and he was a very talented child. He could draw, he knew music, he liked literature. But when he grew up, he didn't immediately go into the literature field as a writer. He pursued a career in law, and he worked for a man named Josiah Hoffman in his office in New York. And there he met his fiancee, Matilda Hoffman. Unfortunately, she died before they were able to actually tie the knot. And after that, Washington Irving, he focused more on law, but his disease, he developed tuberculosis. And his brothers thought it would be a good idea if they just sent him to Rome, Europe, so he could actually just focus on his writings. And that's where he wrote the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, which is where you have Rip Van Winkle, which Ryan did, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which me and Katie did. And three main events that really changed Irving's life, in my opinion, was the death of his fiancée, his unstable health, which actually landed him in Rome, and the death of his mother and the complete bankruptcy of the family business. Like I said, he was born into a wealthy family. He was very spoiled. But this allowed him to focus strictly on his writings, no more law, and this led him to become the father of American literature. Throughout Sleepy Hollow, I noticed that his tone, in my opinion, was determination. And the reason I say that is because I saw a lot of resemblances between him and Ichabod Crane. And now you might say, well, Ichabod died in the end. Okay, well, yeah, he did. But Ichabod was very musically talented as well. And he was very determined to actually be with Katrina Van Tassel, who was rich and who did have a lot of money, even though he was just ugly as all get out. And against this big, muscular man who, ladies are going to fall over for. Because personally, I would pick the big, strong man over the little, wimpy, big-nosed guy, right? And I noticed also that in Rip Van Winkle, that Rip, he was a farmer. He did a lot of work for not himself, but for others. And he was very poor. But I noticed the connection, which Ryan pointed out, between Rip and Irving, as Irving did other work beside what he really loved to do. He did like I said, he did the lawyer work for his family instead of doing just his writings. And of course, like many authors, he did have critics. And most of what I read was just positivity because of the new introducing the actual fiction era. Because during this time, a lot of people were strictly reading the nonfiction stuff. He had one critic named Eckley, and he said that it stood as one of Irving's best efforts in a short story. And that will lead me to the history. Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle were written in 1819, and around this time there was a lot going on in America. We had the Missouri Compromise. We had just gotten done with the American Revolution and the War of 1812. Now, the Missouri Compromise, it showed a level of, the slaves and the whites, the conflict there, which wasn't really relevant in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow or Rip Van Winkle. What you did see was the social class structure. Ichabod was down here. He was a school teacher, kind of poor. You had the Van Tassels up here. They had their own plantation. They were rich, spoiled, all that. And America was going through a time with the sex and the race issues. And most books America wanted to read, like I said, was nonfiction. They did not read for pleasure back in these times because the Industrial Revolution, or not revolution, but industrial, was starting to get more popular. It was moving from agricultural to industrial. And we also had the Panic of 1819, and that was when the economy went from here down to here due to the debts of the War of 1812. And I was reading through Kadeen's work, and I noticed that 1812 in the Horsemen, which I thought was really good because Britain was holding a grudge against us because, we did win our independence, thank God. And they were very bitter about that. They didn't like it, so that's what led to the War of 1812. Well, the Horseman in Sleepy Hollow, before he died, he was actually a British who was hired, or he was a mercenary hired by the British to kill Americans. Well, what happened to the legend of Sleepy Hollow? The headless horseman, he died, right? So that resembles us beating Britain twice. They just couldn't pull one over on us. They couldn't do it. And the customs of the people during this time, they were moving from the farm life to the industrial life. But farming was still a huge thing during this time period. You have games like they liked to box, they liked soccer, they loved bowling, and the women, they wore long skirts, long dresses, and they wore their hair shorter than they had in previous times. Corsets were coming back, and the long pants were actually coming into style for the men. The daily life, family and church were huge during this time. Church was important, and your family was very important. Because, like I said, there were huge families. Like Irving's, he had 11 siblings. That's a lot. And school was actually becoming more popular. People cared to get an education now with all the industry, opportunities coming open. They wanted to make money. They wanted to get away from just the strictly farm life. And what they ate, it was mainly just the crops and, meat. It's nothing like, they didn't have Applebee's or O'Charlie's or anything, but it wasn't like old stuff like back in the 1600s where they had to kill everything. They actually ate, well, you guys know what I mean, just the crops and the animals and stuff like that. And I'll pass it on to Ryan.
Okay.
Oh, and guys, pay attention because at the end, after you guys ask me questions, I'm going to ask 3 questions. And the people who raise their hand the fastest and who know the correct answer gets one of these 3 things right here. Now, everybody's going to get some of this, but, if you don't like this stuff and you don't want to pay attention, that's on you. But if you do and you want to win some of this stuff, then just raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Okay. Like Megan said, I had Rip Van Winkle, and for the sociology, there wasn't really a lot of different interactions between different people groups throughout the story. It's a pretty short story, and it's set in a Dutch village in the Hudson River Valley. But one of the interactions that did kind of take place is Dame Van Winkle, who is Rip Van Winkle's wife. She is kind of viewed as everything that a woman shouldn't be at the time. She was outspoken. She was always on Rip's back, no matter what he did. Trying to get him to work, trying to get him to do all these things, and she wasn't just staying home and minding her own business like everybody thought she should be doing. So throughout the entire story, you kind of get this clash between everybody and Dame Van Winkle. She's made out to be the enemy of the story. And the other big social interaction comes after Rip comes off the mountain where he's been asleep for a really long time. He comes off the mountain and he goes to this inn where he has always talked about politics, talked about what's going on in England at the time, because before he fell asleep, it was before the American Revolution. So that's where they always talked about the business and everything that was going on. And when he comes off the mountain, suddenly the picture has changed a little. The picture on the wall, there used to be a picture on the wall of King Henry. And when he comes back, he's trying to reason with everybody and figure out what's going on. He was like, well, there's King Henry on the wall. I know where I am. But they tell him that's not actually a picture of King Henry. It's a picture of George Washington. So you kind of get a clash of old and new. And throughout this part of the story, they're sort of trying to get the feel of each other, trying to understand how to interact with each other. And other than that, there aren't really many different social interactions that go on. It's really just a story based on this time in Rip's life. And I'm sure most everybody in here knows the story, so I'm not going to go through the plot step by step, but I'll hit on a few details. Basically, Rip's this guy